The garage door rattled shut behind me as I fumbled for the light switch, my hands still trembling from what I'd just heard. Corinne's voice echoed in my mind like a broken record player stuck on the worst song ever written. He gives me what you never could, Arthur, respect and passion. I stood there in the dim fluorescent glow, surrounded by 20 years of accumulated junk, Christmas decorations we hadn't used in 5 years, boxes of Maddie's childhood toys she'd outgrown, and my old boxing equipment gathering dust in the corner. Everything looked the same, but somehow the entire world had shifted on its axis in the span of a 30-second phone conversation. My name is Arthur Waverly, and I run a small auto repair shop in Lakeview, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just honest work with honest pay. I've been married to Corinne for 18 years, and until tonight, I thought we were doing okay. Not perfect, mind you, but okay. The kind of marriage where you settle into comfortable routines and assume your partner feels the same way about everything. Apparently, I was wrong about that last part. I'd come home late from the shop, grease still under my fingernails despite scrubbing them raw in the industrial sink. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Maddie was upstairs in her room, probably scrolling through social media like every other 17-year-old in America. I'd grabbed a beer from the fridge and headed out to the garage to work on my old Mustang, the one project that kept me sane when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. That's when I heard Corinne's voice drifting through the thin wall that separated the garage from the kitchen. She was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. You know that voice. The one your wife uses when she's talking to her sister about something she doesn't want you to hear, or when she's making plans that don't include you. I pressed my ear against the wall like some kind of suburban spy, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop myself. I can't keep pretending everything is fine, she was saying. Arthur comes home every night covered in motor oil, plops down in front of the television and acts like that's enough. Like providing a paycheck is the same thing as being present. My stomach twisted into knots. Who was she talking to? You understand me in ways he never has, she continued. When you look at me, I feel like a woman again, not just a bank manager who happens to sleep in the same house as her husband. Bank manager. That was new. Corinne had been promoted 6 months ago from her position as a loan officer at First National. She'd been so excited about it, talking about how it meant more responsibility, more respect from her colleagues, more opportunities to make a real difference in people's lives. I'd been proud of her, even if I didn't always understand the politics and procedures she dealt with every day. Now I was starting to wonder if there was more to that promotion than she'd let on. He gives me what you never could, Arthur. Respect and passion, she said, her voice growing stronger, more confident. I can't live like this anymore. I won't. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I stood there in the garage, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal shavings, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Respect and passion. I thought about all the times I'd listened to her talk about work problems over dinner, offering advice when she asked for it, and keeping quiet when she just needed to vent. I thought about the flowers I brought home every Friday, the way I always made sure her car was running perfectly, how I never complained when she had to work late or attend those boring bank functions. Apparently, none of that counted as respect. And passion? Well, I'll admit our romantic life had settled into a predictable routine over the years. We weren't teenagers anymore, and between work stress and raising Maddie, spontaneous romance wasn't exactly our strong suit. But I thought we were both okay with that. I thought we'd moved beyond the need for grand gestures and dramatic declarations of love. Another wrong assumption on my part. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but I'd heard enough. Corinne was having an affair. The woman I'd married, the mother of my daughter, the person I'd trusted with every important decision in my life for nearly 2 decades, was involved with someone else. Someone who gave her respect and passion. I walked over to my workbench and picked up a wrench, turning it over in my hands while my mind raced. Part of me wanted to storm into the kitchen and confront her right then and there, demand to know who he was, how long it had been going on, what exactly I'd done wrong to drive her into another man's arms. But another part of me, the part that had learned patience from years of diagnosing tricky engine problems, told me to wait, to observe, to gather information before making any moves. In my line of work, you learn that the obvious problem isn't always the real problem. Sometimes the car won't start because of a simple issue like a loose battery connection, but other times it's symptomatic of something much deeper. A failing alternator, a cracked engine block, something that requires a complete overhaul rather than a quick fix. I had a feeling my marriage might fall into that second category. The kitchen door opened and closed, followed by the sound of Corinne's footsteps on the stairs. I waited another 10 minutes before heading back into the house, trying to compose my face into something resembling normalcy. She was in our bedroom, sitting at her vanity and removing her jewelry with the careful precision she'd always brought to everything in her life. In the mirror, I could see her face, flushed and animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. "How was work today?" I asked, the question coming out more strained than I'd intended. "Fine," she replied without looking at me. "The usual challenges. Nothing you'd find interesting." Nothing I'd find interesting. There it was again. That subtle dismissal, the implication that my world was somehow smaller and less important than hers. "Try me," I said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I might surprise you." She finally turned to face me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance at being challenged. "It's just bank politics, Arthur. Complicated stuff about loan portfolios and regulatory compliance. Not exactly riveting dinner conversation." "Since when do you care about riveting dinner conversation?" I asked. "We've been talking about work stuff for years." "Things change," she said, turning back to the mirror. "People grow. Sometimes they grow in different directions." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I watched her reflection as she applied some kind of cream to her face, going through the motions of our nightly routine while her mind was clearly somewhere else, with someone else. "Corinne?" I started, then stopped. What was I going to say? "I know you're having an affair? I heard you on the phone talking about respect and passion. Confront me with the truth so we can have a screaming match that wakes up Maddie and destroys what's left of our family." "What?" she asked, still not looking at me. "Nothing," I said. "Just, I love you. You know that, right?" She paused in her routine, meeting my eyes in the mirror for the first time all evening. "I know you think you do," she said softly. "Think I do. Not, I love you too, or even, I know." Just an acknowledgement that I believed my own feelings were real, with the clear implication that my perception might be flawed. I went to bed that night lying next to a woman who felt like a complete stranger. She fell asleep quickly, probably exhausted from the emotional weight of living a double life. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, listening to her breathe and trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong without me noticing. By morning, I'd made a decision. If Corinne wanted to itemize my failures as a husband, if she needed someone else to provide what she thought I couldn't, then I was going to find out exactly what that meant. And then I was going to decide what to do about it. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I went to work, came home, made small talk with Corinne about mundane household matters, and pretended I hadn't heard her declare her emotional independence to some mystery man over the phone. But I was watching, learning, paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked, like how she'd started dressing differently for work, more stylish clothes, subtle but noticeable makeup, a new perfume that smelled expensive. She claimed it was part of projecting a more professional image in her management role, and 6 months ago, I would have accepted that explanation without question. Now I wondered who she was really trying to impress. She'd also become protective of her phone in ways that seemed excessive. It never left her side, and she'd changed the lock screen from a family photo to some generic landscape image. When it buzzed with notifications, she'd glance at it with a little smile that never seemed to be directed at anything I'd said or done. The most telling change was in her schedule. Corinne had always been a creature of habit. Home by 6:30, dinner on the table by 7, evening routine that rarely varied. But lately, there were more work events that kept her out late. Board meetings that ran long, client dinners that couldn't be rescheduled, training sessions that seemed to happen at odd hours. I started keeping a mental log of these absences, cross-referencing them with what I knew about the bank's actual schedule. First National wasn't exactly a hotbed of after-hours activity. Most of their business happened during regular banking hours, and the kind of community events they sponsored were typically held on weekends. Yet somehow Corinne's professional obligations had tripled in the past few months. On Thursday evening, she announced she'd be attending a networking mixer downtown and wouldn't be home until late. She kissed my cheek with the same casual affection she might show a brother or cousin, grabbed her purse, and headed for the door. "Which restaurant?" I asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than suspicious. "The Riverside Inn," she replied without hesitation. "Boring banker stuff, but it's good for building relationships with potential commercial clients." I nodded and wished her a good time, then waited exactly 15 minutes before getting in my truck and driving downtown. The Riverside Inn was a mid-scale hotel with a restaurant that catered to business travelers and local professionals. If there really was a banking mixer happening, there should be plenty of cars in the parking lot and people in business attire moving in and out of the building. The parking lot was nearly empty. I sat in my truck for an hour, watching the entrance and feeling like some kind of private investigator in a bad television show. A few couples went in and out, along with what looked like traveling salespeople and tourists. No groups of bankers, no networking mixer, no sign of Corinne's car anywhere. She'd lied to me, directly, confidently, without a moment's hesitation. I drove home and spent the evening helping Maddie with her chemistry homework, both of us pretending not to notice that her mother wasn't where she'd claimed to be. Maddie didn't ask questions. At 17, she was old enough to sense tension between her parents, but smart enough not to poke at it directly. Corinne came home around 11:30, slightly flushed and more animated than I'd seen her in months. She talked about the great conversations she'd had and the valuable connections she'd made, spinning an elaborate story about the evening's fictional events. I listened and nodded and asked appropriate follow-up questions, all while knowing she was lying to my face. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 18 years of marriage. I went through her purse. I felt terrible about it, like I was violating some fundamental trust between us. But then I reminded myself that she'd already shattered that trust by carrying on with another man. I was just trying to understand the scope of the damage. Her purse was a treasure trove of evidence for anyone paying attention. Restaurant receipts from places she'd never mentioned visiting. A hotel keycard that definitely wasn't from the Riverside Inn. Breath mints and perfume samples, the kind of things you carry when you're planning to be close to someone. And at the bottom, folded small and tucked behind her credit cards, a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Last night was perfect. You deserve so much more than what you have. Soon, we won't have to hide anymore. P.P." Her mystery man had a name that started with P, and he was making promises about a future that apparently didn't include me. I photographed the note with my phone, carefully refolded it, and put everything back exactly where I'd found it. Then I went to work and spent the day trying to focus on engine repairs while my mind churned through possibilities. Who was P? Someone from the bank? A client? A complete stranger she'd met somewhere? The answer came to me that weekend in the most mundane way possible. Corinne and I were at the grocery store, going through our usual Saturday morning routine of shopping for the week's meals. We'd just turned into the produce section when I heard someone call her name. "Corinne, What a pleasant surprise! The voice belonged to a man in his mid-40s, well-dressed in the way that suggested money without being flashy about it. He was handsome in a conventional sense, the kind of guy who probably played golf and drove a luxury sedan and knew how to order wine at expensive restaurants. "Preston," Corinne replied, and I caught the slight breathiness in her voice that I now recognized as a warning sign. "I didn't expect to see you here." Preston, P for Preston. "I was just picking up some things for the club," he said, gesturing at his cart which contained what looked like ingredients for upscale appetizers. "We're hosting a private event tonight." The club. That narrowed things down considerably. Lakeview only had a few establishments that called themselves clubs, and most of them were either golf courses or the kind of places that charged membership fees and had dress codes. "Arthur," Corinne said, suddenly remembering I existed, "this is Preston Drake. He owns the Lakeview Gentlemen's Club downtown. Preston, this is my husband." We shook hands, and I made sure to grip his a little tighter than necessary. He had soft hands, the kind that belonged to someone who'd never changed his own oil or fixed a leaky faucet. His smile was perfectly calibrated to be friendly without being overly familiar, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on Corinne when he thought I wasn't looking. "Arthur owns Waverly Auto Repair," Corinne continued, and I noticed she didn't mention it with the same pride she'd used to introduce Preston's business. "Ah, a man who works with his hands," Preston said, and somehow he made it sound like a quaint hobby rather than a respectable profession. "That's admirable. There's something to be said for honest labor." Honest labor. The phrase was perfectly polite and completely condescending at the same time. "Someone has to keep the cars running," I replied. "Can't all be members of private clubs." "Very true," he said, with another practiced smile. "Well, I should let you folks get back to your shopping. Corinne, always a pleasure." He moved on toward the deli counter, and I watched Corinne watch him go. The look on her face was unmistakable, the same expression she used to get when we were dating, and I'd surprise her with flowers or an unexpected kiss. "How do you know him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "The bank handles some of his business accounts," she said, suddenly very interested in selecting the perfect bunch of bananas. "He's been helpful with some of the commercial lending processes I'm learning." More lies, delivered with the same confident ease she'd used to tell me about the networking mixer that never happened. That afternoon, while Corinne was getting her hair done and Maddie was at a friend's house, I drove downtown to get a look at the Lakeview Gentlemen's Club. It was exactly what I'd expected. A converted mansion in the historic district, all dark wood and brass fixtures with a discreet sign and expensive cars in the parking lot. The kind of place where successful men went to drink expensive whiskey and make deals away from their wives and families. The kind of place where a bank manager might go to conduct business with important clients, or to have an affair with the owner. I sat in my truck across the street watching well-dressed people come and go and tried to imagine Corinne in that environment. It wasn't hard. She'd always been more sophisticated than me, more comfortable in social situations that required small talk and networking. I'd assumed she'd settled for me because I was steady and reliable, but maybe what I'd seen as settling had actually been resignation. Maybe she'd been waiting all these years for someone like Preston Drake to come along and offer her the life she thought she deserved. My phone buzzed with a text message from Corinne. "Hair appointment running long. We'll be home by 6. Can you start dinner?" I looked at the timestamp. It was 4:30, and according to her story, she should be sitting in a salon chair getting her hair styled. But I'd been watching the club for 2 hours, and I was pretty sure I'd just seen her car pull into the back parking lot. I texted back, "No problem, take your time." Then I settled in to wait and see how long her hair appointment would really take. She didn't come home until almost 8 o'clock, and when she did, her hair looked exactly the same as it had when she'd left that morning. I spent the next week in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal life, while everything I thought I knew about my marriage crumbled around me. Corinne continued her elaborate charade of fictional work events and extended appointments, each lie delivered with increasing confidence. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to lay out everything I'd discovered and demand an explanation. But another part, the part that had learned patience from years of troubleshooting complex mechanical problems, told me to wait, to gather more information, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I made any irreversible moves. That patience paid off on a Tuesday evening when Corinne announced she'd be working late on a special project that required her to stay at the bank until at least 10 o'clock. "Big presentation tomorrow," she explained, not meeting my eyes as she gathered her things. "I need to make sure everything is perfect." I nodded sympathetically and wished her luck, then waited until her car disappeared around the corner before grabbing my keys and heading downtown. This time, I didn't park across from the club. Instead, I found a spot at the far end of the block where I could observe the back parking lot without being easily noticed. If Corinne was meeting Preston, they'd probably want privacy. I was right. At 7:15, Corinne's Honda pulled into the lot behind the club. She sat in the car for a few minutes, checking her appearance in the rearview mirror and applying lipstick. Then she got out and walked to a side entrance, where Preston was waiting for her. Even from a distance, I could see the way he greeted her, hands on her waist, a kiss that lasted longer than anything that could be considered professional. She melted into him with a familiarity that spoke of weeks or months of practice. They disappeared into the building, and I was left sitting alone in my truck, watching the windows of what I assumed was Preston's private office glow with warm light. I should have left then, should have driven home and figured out how to process what I'd seen. Instead, I found myself walking around to the front of the building, drawn by some masochistic need to understand exactly what my wife was doing with another man. The main entrance was locked, but there was a service door near the kitchen that had been propped open, probably for deliveries or staff taking smoke breaks. I slipped inside, feeling like a criminal, but unable to stop myself. The club's interior was even more impressive than I'd imagined, all leather furniture and oil paintings, with the kind of understated elegance that screamed money. I could hear voices and laughter from the main dining room, but the administrative offices were on the second floor, accessible by a back staircase that seemed to be used primarily by staff. I climbed those stairs like a man walking to his own execution, each step bringing me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face. The office door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see Corinne and Preston sitting close together on a leather sofa, sharing a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I made in a day. "I can't keep doing this," Corinne was saying, her voice soft but intense. "The lying, the sneaking around. It's not fair to anyone." "I know," Preston replied, reaching over to stroke her cheek with the kind of gentle intimacy I hadn't seen directed at my wife in years. "But we need to be smart about this. My divorce attorney says the settlement could be complicated if Judith finds out about us before the papers are finalized." Divorce attorney. So Preston was married too, and apparently planning to leave his wife just as Corinne was planning to leave me. "What about Arthur?" Corinne asked. "He's not stupid. I think he's starting to suspect something." "Arthur," Preston said with a dismissive chuckle, "is a mechanic who comes home covered in grease every night and thinks bringing you grocery store flowers makes him romantic. Trust me, he's not going to figure out what's happening here." The casual contempt in his voice hit me like a physical blow. This man didn't just want my wife. He actively despised me, saw me as some kind of blue-collar stereotype too simple to understand what was happening in his own home. "He's a good man," Corinne said, though her defense sounded half-hearted. "He doesn't deserve this." "Good men finish last, sweetheart," Preston replied, pulling her closer. "You deserve someone who can give you the life you've always wanted, someone who understands your ambitions and can match them." "You make me feel alive again," she whispered, "like I'm more than just someone's wife and mother." "You are so much more than that," he said, and then they were kissing with a passion that made my stomach turn. I backed away from the door and made my way downstairs, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and heartbreak. The woman I'd loved for 18 years, the mother of my daughter, was upstairs in another man's arms, talking about me like I was some kind of obstacle to be managed, rather than a human being whose life was being destroyed. I drove home in a daze, my mind cycling through everything I'd seen and heard. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the initial shock had begun to crystallize into something harder and more focused. Corinne came home at 10:30, full of stories about her successful presentation and the positive feedback she'd received from her supervisors. She was glowing with satisfaction, though I now understood it had nothing to do with her fictional work accomplishments. "How was your evening?" she asked, settling into bed beside me with the casual affection of 18 years of marriage. "Quiet," I said. "Watched some television. Helped Maddie with her history project." "That's nice," she murmured, already half asleep. "I'm so tired. This project has been exhausting." I lay awake for hours, listening to her breathe and thinking about everything Preston had said. Good men finish last. Arthur is just a mechanic. He doesn't deserve this, but he's too simple to figure it out. Maybe he was right about good men finishing last, but he was wrong about me being too simple to figure out what was happening, and he was definitely wrong about what I deserved. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going directly to the shop, I drove to the office of Tom Bradley, the lawyer who'd handled the paperwork when I'd incorporated my business 5 years earlier. "Arthur," Tom said, looking surprised to see me in his waiting room at 8 in the morning. "What brings you by? Please tell me you're not having tax problems." "Nothing like that," I said, following him into his office. "I need to talk to someone about divorce law." Tom's expression grew serious. He was a good man, someone I'd known since high school, and I could see him mentally shifting into professional mode. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "How can I help?" I told him everything: the overheard phone call, the lies about work events, the evidence I'd gathered, what I'd witnessed at the club. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. "So she's having an affair with Preston Drake," he said when I finished. "That's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Preston's going through a divorce himself right now. Nasty one, from what I hear through the legal community. His wife Judith is being represented by Morrison and Associates. They're the most aggressive firm in the state when it comes to marital dissolution." "What does that mean for me?" "It means you need to be very careful about how you handle this," Tom said. "If Corinne is involved with Preston while he's still married, and if his wife's attorneys find out about it, things could get messy very quickly." "Messy how?" "Adultery can affect property division, spousal support, even custody arrangements in some cases. If you're smart about this, you might be able to use the situation to your advantage." Tom spent the next hour explaining my options, the legal implications of Corinne's affair, and the steps I should take to protect myself financially. By the time I left his office, I had a clear understanding of where I stood and what I needed to do. I also had a plan. That evening, I did something I'd never done in 18 years of marriage. I confronted my wife directly about her lies. "How was the presentation today?" I asked over dinner, watching her face carefully. "Excellent," she said without hesitation. Mr. Henderson said it was one of the most comprehensive loan portfolio analyses he'd seen. "That's interesting," I said, "because I called the bank this afternoon to see if I could take you to lunch as a surprise, and they told me you'd taken a personal day." The fork stopped halfway to her mouth. For just a moment I saw panic flicker in her eyes before she recovered her composure. "I did take the morning off," she said smoothly. "The presentation was this afternoon, and I wanted to make sure I was well rested." "So you spent the morning at home?" "I went shopping, picked up some things for the house." "What kind of things?" "Arthur, what is this? Why are you interrogating me about my schedule?" Because you're lying to me, I said quietly. You've been lying to me for months. The silence that followed was deafening. Maddie looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. I think I'll eat upstairs, she said, grabbing her plate and disappearing before either of us could respond. I don't know what you think you know, Corinne said once we were alone, but I know about Preston Drake, I interrupted. I know about the club, the fake work events, all of it. Her face went pale, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked at me with a defiance I'd never seen before. How long have you known? Long enough, I said. The question is, what are we going to do about it? What do you want me to say, Arthur? That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? That would be a start. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to know the truth? I'm not sorry. For the first time in years, I feel like myself again. Preston sees me as more than just a wife and mother. He respects my intelligence, my ambitions. He makes me feel alive. And I don't? When was the last time you asked me about my dreams, Arthur? When was the last time you planned a surprise for me, or took me somewhere special, or made me feel like I was more than just someone to cook your dinner and wash your clothes? I bring you flowers every Friday. Grocery store flowers, she said dismissively. The same ones you've been buying for 10 years because you saw them once in the checkout line and decided that was enough effort. The words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. I had fallen into routines, had taken her for granted in ways I was only now beginning to understand. So this is my fault? I asked. It's nobody's fault, she said, her voice softening slightly. We just grew apart. It happens. Growing apart is one thing, Corinne. Having an affair is something else entirely. I know, she whispered. But I can't help how I feel. Preston gives me something you never could, respect and passion. I can't pretend that doesn't matter. There it was, the same phrase I'd heard her use on the phone weeks earlier, delivered now as a direct indictment of our entire marriage. So what happens now? I asked. I don't know, she said. I need time to think. Time to figure out if Preston is going to leave his wife for you? She flinched as if I'd slapped her. It's not that simple. It never is, I said, standing up from the table. But here's something that is simple, Corinne. You can't have both. You can't keep me as your safety net while you explore your options with someone else. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to make a choice, him or me. But you don't get to keep lying to me while you figure it out. I left her sitting at the kitchen table and went upstairs to check on Maddie, who was pretending to do homework while obviously listening to every word of our conversation. Are you and Mom getting divorced? She asked without looking up from her textbook. I don't know, sweetheart, I said honestly. We're having some problems. Because of that guy from the grocery store? Smart kid. Too smart for her own good sometimes. It's complicated, I said, sitting down on the edge of her bed. But whatever happens between your mother and me, it doesn't change how much we both love you. She nodded, still not meeting my eyes. I know. I kissed the top of her head and went to bed, leaving Corinne downstairs to think about the choice I'd given her. She made her decision 3 days later. I'm leaving, Arthur. The words came at breakfast on a Saturday morning, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone Corinne might use to announce she was going to the grocery store. Maddie had spent the night at a friend's house, so it was just the two of us sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of 18 years of shared mornings. For how long? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Permanently, she said, not meeting my eyes. I've rented a small apartment downtown. I'll be moving my things out this weekend. I set down my coffee cup and studied her face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or regret. There was none. In the 3 days since our confrontation, she'd apparently made peace with her decision to choose Preston over our marriage. What about Maddie? She can stay here during the week for school, spend weekends with me until we figure out a more permanent arrangement. How generous of you. Don't, she said sharply. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder than it has to be? I repeated. Corinne, you're walking out on 18 years of marriage. You're breaking up our family. Exactly how easy did you think this was going to be? I know you're angry. Angry doesn't begin to cover it. But this is better for everyone. We haven't been happy for a long time, Arthur. We've just been going through the motions. I was happy, I said quietly. Maybe not ecstatic every single day, but content. Satisfied with what we'd built together. Content isn't enough anymore, she replied. I want more than that. You want Preston. I want a life where I feel valued and appreciated, where someone sees me as more than just a reliable presence in their daily routine. The accusation stung because it forced me to examine my own behavior over the past few years. Had I taken her for granted? Probably. Had I fallen into comfortable patterns that prioritized routine over romance? Definitely. But did that justify what she'd done? So you decided to have an affair instead of talking to me about how you felt? Would it have made a difference? She asked. If I'd come to you 6 months ago and said I was feeling neglected and unappreciated, would you have actually changed anything? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. Would I have made an effort to be more romantic, more attentive, or would I have dismissed her concerns as temporary dissatisfaction that would pass with time? I guess we'll never know, I said. No, she agreed. We won't. She left that afternoon while I was at the shop, taking only her clothes and personal items. When I came home, the house felt hollow, in a way that had nothing to do with missing furniture. It was the absence of her presence, the sounds she made moving through familiar spaces, the subtle scents of her perfume and shampoo, the 1,000 small signs that someone else shared this space with me. Maddie took the news about as well as could be expected, which is to say she locked herself in her room and refused to talk to either of us for the better part of a week. When she finally emerged, she was different, more guarded, less trusting of the adults in her life who had promised her stability and then shattered it without warning. This isn't your fault, I told her one evening as we sat in the living room, both of us pretending to watch television while actually thinking about all the ways our family had changed. I know, she said, but I could tell she didn't really believe it. Your mother and we just couldn't figure out how to make each other happy anymore. So she decided to try with someone else instead. The bitterness in her voice was startling. At 17, Maddie was old enough to understand the basic facts of what had happened, and she'd clearly chosen sides in the dissolution of our marriage. It's more complicated than that, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Is it? She asked. Because it seems pretty simple to me. She wanted something different, so she went out and got it without caring who she hurt in the process. I didn't have a good response to that, so I just put my arm around her and let her lean against me while we both tried to process the new reality of our reduced family. Over the next few weeks, I established new routines that accommodated our changed circumstances. Maddie and I figured out how to manage household responsibilities that Corinne had previously handled. I learned to cook meals that were more elaborate than sandwiches and frozen dinners. She took over the laundry and grocery shopping with the grim efficiency of someone who'd been forced to grow up faster than she should have. Meanwhile, Corinne seemed to be thriving in her new life. The few times I saw her, during awkward exchanges when she picked up Maddie for weekend visits, she looked happier and more energetic than I'd seen her in years. Her clothes were more stylish, her hair was professionally styled, and she carried herself with a confidence that spoke of someone who felt she'd made the right choice. It was infuriating, not because I wanted her to be miserable exactly, but because her obvious happiness made it clear that leaving me hadn't been a difficult decision. She wasn't suffering from regret or second thoughts. She wasn't questioning whether she'd made a mistake. She was simply moving forward with her new life, as if our 18-year marriage had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The divorce proceedings began 6 weeks after she moved out. Tom Bradley handled my side of the paperwork with professional efficiency, while Corinne hired a lawyer from the same firm that was representing Preston's wife in his divorce. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was paying legal fees to the very people who were working to destroy her new boyfriend's financial future. "She's not thinking clearly," Tom explained during one of our meetings. "Morrison and Associates are sharks. They're going to use every piece of information they can get their hands on, including details about her relationship with their other client's husband." "What does that mean for me?" "It means you might want to be patient and see how Preston's divorce plays out before you finalize your own," he said. "Depending on how aggressive Judith Drake's attorneys get, Corinne might find herself in a very different position than she's expecting." I took his advice and agreed to a temporary separation rather than rushing toward a final divorce decree. Corinne seemed relieved. I think she'd been worried I might try to make things difficult out of spite or anger. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't being accommodating out of kindness. I was being strategic. Because while she was busy building her new life with Preston, I was learning everything I could about the man who'd stolen my wife. And what I was discovering suggested that Corinne might not have chosen as wisely as she thought. Preston Drake was 43 years old, twice divorced, and the owner of several businesses in addition to the Gentlemen's Club. On paper, he looked successful and stable, exactly the kind of man who could provide the lifestyle Corinne thought she deserved. But paper didn't tell the whole story. Through casual conversations with other business owners downtown, I learned that Preston's enterprises weren't as profitable as they appeared. The club was struggling to compete with newer establishments, and his other investments had been hit hard by recent economic downturns. He was leveraged to the hilt, with loans and mortgages that required constant refinancing to stay current. More importantly, his current divorce was going to be financially devastating. Judith Drake had been his business partner as well as his wife, and she owned significant stakes in several of his companies. Her attorneys were systematically dismantling his empire, claiming assets, and demanding settlements that would leave him with a fraction of his current wealth. Preston was putting on a good show for Corinne, maintaining the appearance of success while his financial foundation crumbled beneath him. But it was only a matter of time before reality caught up with his carefully constructed image. I could have warned Corinne, could have shared what I'd learned and given her a chance to reconsider her choices before it was too late. Instead, I decided to wait and watch. If she wanted to learn about respect and passion from Preston Drake, then she was going to get the full education, including the final exam that would test whether those qualities could survive financial ruin and public humiliation. I gave her something she'd asked for, the freedom to make her own choices and live with the consequences. And I gave myself something I'd never had before, a front-row seat to watch karma do its work. 3 months after Corinne moved out, Preston Drake's carefully constructed world began to collapse in spectacular fashion. It started with a story in the local newspaper's business section, a small item about the Lakeview Gentlemen's Club filing for bankruptcy protection. The reporter had done his homework, detailing Preston's mounting debts and the ongoing legal battles with his estranged wife over business assets. I was reading the article over coffee when Maddie came downstairs for breakfast, already dressed for school and moving with the efficient precision she'd developed since becoming the de facto manager of our household. "Mom's boyfriend is in trouble," she said, glancing at the newspaper headline. "Looks that way," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Good," she said with the fierce satisfaction of someone whose family had been destroyed by the man in question. "I hope he loses everything." I wanted to tell her that revenge fantasies weren't healthy, that she shouldn't wish misfortune on others even when they'd wronged us. But the truth was, I was having a hard time feeling sorry for Preston myself. The newspaper story was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more details emerged about the scope of Preston's financial problems. The club wasn't just struggling, It was hemorrhaging money and facing foreclosure. His other businesses were similarly over-leveraged, propped up by a complex web of loans and credit arrangements that were now unraveling. Worse, from Preston's perspective, was the way his divorce was playing out in public. Judith Drake's attorneys had turned the proceedings into a masterclass in legal warfare, systematically exposing every questionable business decision and personal indiscretion Preston had committed during their marriage, including his affair with Corinne. The details were laid out in court documents that quickly became public record: dates, locations, financial expenditures Preston had made to impress his new girlfriend. The lawyers had done their research, documenting everything from expensive dinners at the club to weekend trips that had been charged to business accounts. Corinne's name appeared throughout the filings, identified as the other woman whose relationship with Preston had contributed to the breakdown of his marriage. Her professional reputation, which she'd worked so hard to build at the bank, was suddenly linked to a very public and very messy adultery scandal. I learned about this development through Sandy Morrison, our neighbor who'd appointed herself the neighborhood's unofficial information clearinghouse. She appeared at my front door on a Thursday evening, practically vibrating with the excitement of someone who had juicy gossip to share. "Arthur," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "have you seen the court documents from the Drake divorce?" "I don't make a habit of reading other people's legal proceedings," I replied, though that wasn't entirely true. Tom Bradley had been keeping me informed about developments that might affect my own situation. "Well, you might want to make an exception in this case," she said, pulling out her phone and showing me a local news website. "Your wife is mentioned by name 17 times. The article was brutal in its clinical detailing of Preston's extramarital activities. It included photographs taken by private investigators, financial records showing money spent on gifts and entertainment, and even copies of text messages that had been recovered during the discovery process. Reading it felt like watching a car accident in slow motion, horrible, but impossible to look away from. "I thought you should know," Sandy said with the kind of false sympathy that barely concealed her excitement about being the bearer of dramatic news. "People are talking." Of course they were talking. In a town the size of Lakeview, a scandal involving prominent local figures was the kind of entertainment that could sustain months of speculation and gossip. Corinne had gone from being a respected bank manager to being the subject of whispered conversations at grocery stores and coffee shops. I thanked Sandy for the information and closed the door, then sat down to read the full article and consider what it meant for everyone involved. For Preston, it was a complete disaster. The court documents made it clear that his affair with Corinne had violated the terms of his prenuptial agreement with Judith, triggering penalty clauses that would cost him millions in additional settlements. His business empire, already struggling, wouldn't survive the financial hit. For Corinne, it was a professional and social catastrophe. The bank where she worked prided itself on conservative values and community respectability. Having one of their managers publicly identified as the other woman in a high-profile divorce case wasn't the kind of publicity they wanted. For me, it was validation of a strategy I hadn't even realized I was pursuing. By refusing to rush into divorce proceedings, by letting Corinne make her own choices without interference, I'd allowed the situation to play out naturally. And the natural consequences were far more devastating than anything I could have orchestrated myself. My phone rang later that evening. Corinne's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering. We hadn't spoken directly since the separation agreement had been signed, communicating only through lawyers and brief exchanges during Maddie's weekend visits. But curiosity won out over caution. "Hello, Corinne." "Arthur." Her voice sounded strained, exhausted in a way I hadn't heard since the early days of Maddie's infancy, when we'd both been running on too little sleep and too much stress. I need to talk to you." "About what?" "About everything. This whole situation with Preston, the divorce, the things that are being said about me." What about them? I made a mistake, she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been practicing them. A terrible mistake. I let myself get caught up in something that wasn't real, and now everything is falling apart. I waited for her to continue, curious about where this conversation was heading. The bank let me go today, she said. They called it a mutual agreement to part ways, but we both know what it really was. They can't have someone involved in this kind of scandal representing their institution. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? She asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. Because I wouldn't blame you if you were happy about this. I know how badly I hurt you. I'm not happy about it, I said, and realized I was telling the truth. Despite everything she'd done, I didn't take pleasure in seeing her suffer. But I'm not surprised by it either. Preston isn't who I thought he was, she continued. The things that are coming out in his divorce, the financial problems, the other women, the way he's been lying about everything. I feel like such a fool. Other women. That was new information, though not particularly shocking, given what I'd learned about Preston's character. What do you want from me, Corinne? I want to come home, she said quietly. I want to try to fix what I broke. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. The request hung in the air between us, and I found myself thinking about all the conversations we might have had months earlier if she'd been willing to talk about her unhappiness instead of acting on it. It doesn't work that way, I said finally. You can't just decide you made a mistake and expect everything to go back to the way it was. I know that, but maybe we could start over, build something new. Based on what? Trust? Respect? You threw both of those away when you decided Preston could give you something I couldn't. I was wrong about that. No, I said. You were right. Preston did give you something I couldn't. He gave you exactly what you deserved. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Arthur, he gave you drama instead of stability, excitement instead of security, public humiliation instead of private respect. You said you wanted passion and you got it, along with all the chaos that comes with it. Please don't do this. I'm not doing anything, Corinne. I'm just pointing out that you got exactly what you asked for. Preston gave you something I never could, and now you're living with the consequences of that choice. So that's it? You're not even willing to consider trying again? I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Part of me, the part that remembered 18 years of shared history, that still cared about the woman I'd married, wanted to say yes. Wanted to believe that people could change, that mistakes could be forgiven, that love could overcome betrayal. But a larger part of me, the part that had spent months watching her lie to my face while she pursued another man, knew that some things couldn't be undone. I gave you 18 years of my life, I said. I gave you loyalty, stability, and as much love as I knew how to show. It wasn't enough for you then, and I don't see any reason to believe it would be enough now. I've changed. Have you? Or are you just scared because your backup plan didn't work out the way you expected? She didn't have an answer for that. I have to go, she said finally. Maddie's here, and she's upset about everything that's happening. Tell her I love her, I said. And Corinne? I hope things work out for you. I really do. But they're going to have to work out somewhere else, with someone else. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet house, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between love and passion, about the price of getting exactly what you think you want. Outside, Sandy Morrison was walking her dog, and probably hoping to catch a glimpse of some additional drama through my windows. The whole neighborhood would know about Corinne's phone call by tomorrow morning, adding another chapter to the ongoing saga that had become our lives. But for the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. Not happiness, exactly, but a sense of resolution. The woman who had promised to love me for better or worse had chosen to leave when things felt routine rather than work to make them better. She'd pursued respect and passion with someone else, and discovered that both came with costs she hadn't anticipated. I'd given her something she'd asked for, freedom to make her own choices, and karma had given her something else entirely, a comprehensive education in the difference between what you want and what you actually need. The balance, as it turned out, didn't require any additional signatures from me. 6 months later, I was working late at the shop when Tom Bradley stopped by with news about the final resolution of Preston Drake's divorce. "Judith got everything," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just witnessed justice being served. "The club, the other businesses, their house, most of their liquid assets. Preston's going to be lucky if he walks away with enough money to rent a decent apartment." "What about the bankruptcy?" "That's going forward too. Turns out he'd been using business funds to finance his lifestyle for years, including his relationship with Corinne. Judith's attorneys documented every questionable expense, and the court wasn't sympathetic." I nodded, not particularly surprised by the outcome. Preston had built his life on appearances and leverage, and when both collapsed simultaneously, there hadn't been anything substantial left to fall back on. "Any word on what he's planning to do now?" "Last I heard, he was looking for work in Columbus. Apparently, his reputation in Lakeview is too damaged for him to rebuild here." "And Corinne?" Tom's expression grew more serious. "She's struggling. Lost the apartment when she couldn't make rent without her bank salary. She's been staying with her sister in Akron and working at a department store while she looks for something in her field." "That's rough." "It gets worse. Maddie told my daughter that Preston broke up with her right after the divorce was finalized. Apparently, he decided that being associated with her was hurting his chances of starting over somewhere else." I absorbed this information without comment. Part of me felt vindicated. Preston had turned out to be exactly the kind of man I'd suspected he was, someone who was willing to make promises he had no intention of keeping. But another part of me just felt tired. The whole situation had been a waste of time, energy, and emotion that had accomplished nothing except destroying a family and ruining several lives. "She's been calling you," Tom said. It wasn't a question. "Every few weeks," I confirmed. "Always the same conversation. She made a mistake, she's learned from it, she wants another chance." "What do you tell her?" "That some mistakes can't be undone." Tom nodded approvingly. "Probably for the best. Trust is like a broken bone. It might heal, but it's never quite as strong as it was before." After he left, I finished up the paperwork I'd been working on and locked up the shop. The drive home took me through downtown, past the building that had housed Preston's club. It was dark now, with a "for lease" sign in the window and weeds growing in the parking lot where expensive cars used to gather. At home, Maddie was in the kitchen doing homework while dinner warmed in the oven. She'd grown up a lot over the past year, taking on responsibilities that shouldn't have fallen to someone her age, but handling them with a maturity that made me proud. "How was work?" she asked without looking up from her calculus textbook. "Busy. How was school?" "Fine. Mom called this afternoon." I waited for her to elaborate, but she seemed focused on her math problems. "What did she want?" "The usual. She's found a new apartment. She's got a job interview next week. She misses us and wants to know if we'd consider visiting her in Akron." "What did you tell her?" Maddie finally looked up from her homework, and I saw something in her expression that reminded me of myself, a kind of weary patience that came from dealing with people who kept making the same mistakes over and over again. I told her I was happy she was getting back on her feet, but that I wasn't ready for visits yet. Maybe someday, but not now. "That seems fair." "She cried," Maddie added matter-of-factly. "She does that every time I don't give her the answer she wants. She's going through a difficult time." "So were we," Maddie replied. "But we didn't abandon each other to make ourselves feel better." There wasn't much I could say to that. My daughter had drawn her own conclusions about what had happened to our family, and they weren't particularly charitable toward her mother. I'd tried to encourage forgiveness and understanding, But Maddie was old enough to make her own judgments about character and consequences. We ate dinner together and talked about her college plans, her part-time job at the local veterinary clinic, and the boy she'd been dating who seemed decent enough to earn my grudging approval. Normal family conversations that felt both precious and fragile after everything we'd been through. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. Corinne's name appeared on the caller ID, and for once, I answered without hesitation. "Hello, Corinne?" "Arthur." She sounded different, steadier, less desperate than in our previous conversations. "I wanted to let you know that I got the job, assistant manager at a credit union in Akron. It's not much, but it's a start." "That's good news. I'm happy for you." "Thank you. And Arthur?" "I wanted to apologize. Not for leaving. I think we both know that was probably inevitable. But for the way I left. For the lying and the cheating, and the way I made you feel like our marriage was your fault." "I appreciate that. I've been seeing a counselor," she continued, "trying to understand why I made the choices I did, why I threw away something good for something that turned out to be an illusion." "What did you figure out?" "That I was looking for someone else to make me feel valuable instead of finding that value in myself. That I confused excitement with happiness, drama with passion. That I hurt the people who loved me most because I was too scared to do the hard work of fixing what was broken." It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years. "I'm glad you're getting help," I said. "You deserve to be happy, Corinne. Just not with me." "I know," she said quietly. "I know that now. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I lost. You gave me 18 years of steady, reliable love, and I threw it away because I thought I deserved something more exciting. I was wrong. We both made mistakes. Maybe. But mine were bigger, and they hurt more people." After we hung up, I sat in my bedroom thinking about forgiveness and second chances, about the difference between understanding someone's actions and excusing them. Corinne was right. She had thrown away something good for something that turned out to be an illusion. But understanding why she'd made that choice didn't change the consequences of it. Some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired. Some betrayals, once committed, couldn't be forgiven. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because the foundation of trust required to rebuild a relationship had been too thoroughly destroyed. I'd given Corinne something she'd asked for, respect and passion from someone who saw her as more than just a wife and mother. Preston had provided both, along with excitement, drama, and ultimately heartbreak. In return, life had given her something else, a comprehensive education in the difference between what we think we want and what we actually need, between the thrill of new romance and the security of committed love, between passion that burns bright and fast and affection that grows stronger over time. She'd learned that respect earned through deception isn't really respect at all. That passion built on lies doesn't last when the truth comes out. That the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Sometimes it's just different grass with different problems. The balance had been restored, not through any action on my part, but through the natural consequences of choices freely made. Karma hadn't needed my help. It had simply allowed everyone involved to get exactly what they'd asked for, along with everything that came with it. And in the end, that had been more than enough.